Okay, so today we're going to look at something pretty basic, but it's something that we kind of take for granted sometimes.
Mm.
It's the language of math.
Right.
And you had sent over some really interesting material from an English language learning resource, and it kind of made us realize
Yeah.
how we just assume that people know all these basic terms for like
Yeah.
adding, subtracting, multiplying, things like that.
Exactly.
So our mission today is to really unpack this basic mathematical vocabulary so you can understand it perfectly clearly,
Mm.
confidently talk about math in English
I
and
love it.
because language is fun. We're also going to look at some of the colorful ways that English speakers describe people
Okay.
who are good at math, or at least try to seem like they're good at math.
Yeah, those are always interesting.
Yeah, and some of them are not so flattering.
He's definitely not.
But what's really cool about what you sent over is that it's in the form of a classroom dialogue. So you see these terms actually being used in a real world context.
Right. Yeah. It's like we're a fly on the wall in this classroom,
Exactly.
seeing how these terms are actually used.
Yeah, so let's just dive right into it. Okay. Let's start with the absolute basics. How we actually say the basic mathematical operations in English.
Okay. That was good.
So the dialogue starts off with 4 plus 11. And of course, the key word there is plus,
Right.
the plus sign.
Yeah.
And the lesson gives some more examples like 2 plus 2 equals 4. Or we could also say 5 plus 5 is 10.
Uh-huh.
And it also talks about the action of adding. So we are adding these numbers together. So, it seems simple enough.
Yeah.
But it's important to have this foundation really solid.
And it's interesting, too, to think about how plus is a word that's used even outside of English-speaking countries.
Yeah.
It's become this almost universal term. But I think hearing it in complete sentences really reinforces how we use it grammatically.
Yeah.
And thinking about that verb, adding, really highlights that dynamic process
Right.
of what's going on.
Exactly. Yeah. So we start with putting things together, and then naturally we come to taking things away,
Of course, the opposite.
which is subtraction.
Yes.
So the example they give is 5660. And the lesson points out there are a couple of ways to say this. So we can use minus 56 minus 60 equals minus 4.
Right.
And we can also use the phrase take away. So if you have 56 and you take away 60,
Exactly.
which is, in the real world, you can't really do that if you only have 56 objects.
You can't take away more than you have.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, but you can in math. So I think what's interesting here is that takeaway is really descriptive.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really paints this picture
It does.
of,
Yeah.
something being removed.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's interesting how they explain -4 as -4, which is kind of the more mathematical term,
Right.
but then also as 4 less than 0,
Yeah.
which I think is a really accessible way for someone who maybe hasn't really encountered negative numbers before
Right.
to understand what that means.
Yeah. And even for someone who has, been working with these concepts for a long time,
Yeah.
hearing it phrased in a slightly different way,
Uh-huh.
I think that's what's so great about studying language, even at this really fundamental level.
Absolutely.
It really deepens your understanding.
It does.
So we go from adding and subtracting, and now we come to multiplication.
Right.
And they use the example 12, 12. And of course, the main term we use for that is times.
Yeah. 12 times 12.
Exactly. So 12 times 12. And the lesson also introduces the words multiplying and multiplication as kind of the bigger concept.
The operation itself.
Right. And I thought this explanation was really cool.
Yeah.
It says that, 4 times 4 is the same as adding 4 to itself 4 times.
All right. So it's like 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4.
Exactly. 4 plus 4 plus 4 plus 4. And I thought that was just such a nice, elegant way to bring it back to...
It all comes back to addition.
Yeah, it all
Yeah.
goes back to addition.
And I think making that connection is so important because it shows how these operations are all related to each other.
Right.
Like using times is just a faster way
Yeah,
to do repeated addition.
exactly.
And once you understand that, it makes multiplication feel much less mysterious.
Less abstract.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so then, of course, we have the inverse of multiplication, which is division.
Right.
And they use the example 0 by 1.
Okay.
And the key phrase here is divided by.
Uh-huh.
And we also see another example, 15 divided by 3 equals 5.
Right.
And then division is introduced as the overall concept.
Yeah.
So pretty straightforward. Divided by really shows us the relationship
Yeah.
between the numbers.
Yeah, divided by is the most common way that we're going to express division in English.
Right.
It just tells us, this number is being split up into this many pieces.
Exactly. And then finally, for our basic operations, we have the square root of 2, and here square root is the term itself.
Oh, okay.
And the lesson kind of explains it with some simpler examples. So it says the square root of 9 is 3, the square root of 4 is 2, the square root of 16 is 4. And these really help you visualize what a square root is. It's that number that when multiplied by itself gives you the original number.
Right. And it's smart to start with those perfect squares before you get into something like the square root of 2, which is not a whole number.
Right.
So I think it's a really good way to build up that understanding.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've got all the core math vocabulary down.
We got our foundations.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And the cool thing about this material is that it also talks about how we describe people.
Right.
Especially in a school environment.
Yeah, like in this classroom setting.
Yeah, so this brings us to some more colorful English terms for people who are good at math, or at least seem to be good at math.
Right. And these aren't always nice words.
Yeah.
Like you said.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Some of these are not compliments at all.
Definitely not.
But they're definitely interesting.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting how language reflects those social dynamics.
Yeah. Yeah.
And how people view academic success.
Absolutely. Yeah, so the first term that Tommy uses to describe Crystal, who's clearly doing well in math class, is teacher's pet. And the lesson explains that this is, often the teacher's favorite student.
Right.
Maybe the smartest kid in the class.
Yeah.
But there's definitely a negative connotation there.
Oh, yeah.
It kind of suggests that maybe they're not getting there just on their own merits,
Right. It implies that they're trying to get on the teacher's good side.
Exactly, yeah.
Maybe sucking up a little bit.
Yeah, and that their success is not completely because of their ability.
Exactly, yeah.
And then Tommy actually takes it a step further, and he calls Crystal a suck-up.
Oh, wow.
So this is defined as someone who, really tries hard to get the teacher, or later in life maybe their boss, to like them.
Right.
And this one has an even stronger negative meaning because it really suggests that the person is being insincere. They're trying to get some kind of advantage.
Right, yeah.
By being, flattering.
Instead of just doing the work.
Yeah, exactly, rather than through their own hard work. And I think these terms are really interesting because they reveal how
we feel about fairness.
Yeah, this anxiety about, is this really fair?
Yeah, exactly. And how people get ahead.
Right. Is it about, who you know rather than what you know? And so maybe these terms are a way for students to express that discomfort with, what seems like favoritism or not genuine behavior.
Exactly.
So later on, the teacher herself uses the term smarty pants. And this is after Crystal correctly answers a question about 0 divided by 1.
Okay.
So no, this one is a little different because the lesson points out that it's mainly used for children.
Yeah, you wouldn't call an adult smarty pants.
Right. Unless you were joking around.
Unless you were being very playful.
Exactly. Yeah. And, it can be a way to tease someone a little bit.
Yeah, it's like you're showing off a little bit.
Right. You're being a little bit too clever.
But it's not really that serious.
Right. It's not, a serious insult. It's more lighthearted.
Exactly. And the tone of voice is important with that one.
Yeah, definitely. So that brings us to our last term in this category, which is know-it-all.
Ah, yes. The classic know-it-all.
So this one describes someone who tries to show everyone that they know absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And the lesson really emphasizes that this can be very annoying.
Yeah.
And that it's generally not a positive thing to be called a know-it-all.
Nobody wants to be called a know-it-all.
No, definitely not.
And it suggests someone's arrogant.
Yes, exactly. There's that element of arrogance.
Right. They not only have the knowledge, but they feel like they have to show it off to everyone.
Right, and make everyone else feel less than.
Yeah, exactly.
So it really highlights that social aspect of, knowledge and how it's shared.
Right.
Or not shared.
Exactly.
So we've looked at the language of math operations and these, sometimes pretty harsh terms for the smart kids.
Yeah. We've covered a lot.
But the lesson also includes this little section where the hosts talk about their own experiences with math.
Oh, cool.
And then there's also a short conversation between two students about their favorite subjects, which I thought was really relatable.
Oh, yeah. I love when they add those personal touches.
Yeah, it really brings it to life.
It does. It shows that math is something that everyone has a relationship with.
Right.
Whether they're good at it or not.
Exactly. And, one of the hosts talks about really not liking math and struggling with it, even with simple things. They even joke about having trouble remembering their phone number.
Oh, wow.
And then the other host talks about how they really enjoyed math as a kid because it just made sense.
Yeah.
And they even liked chemistry because it has a lot of math in it, too.
Of course.
So it just goes to show you how differently our brains work.
Absolutely. And I think those contrasting perspectives really highlight the fact that learning is individual.
Right.
Like what's easy for one person
Yeah.
might be a huge struggle for another person.
Exactly, and that's totally okay.
Yeah.
And then we get this great little dialogue between two students, and one of them says they love math because it's like solving puzzles, and that they really enjoyed geometry. And then the other student says they find math really difficult, especially algebra.
Yeah.
And then they talk about how to deal with those, tricky math problems, and they suggest breaking them down into smaller steps.
Right.
And of course, asking the teacher for help.
Always a good idea.
Yeah, always a good strategy.
Yeah.
And they also touch on this really crucial point that math builds on itself.
Right. You can't skip
You
ahead.
can't just jump to the end.
You got to build that foundation.
Yeah, you really have to have that solid foundation.
Yeah.
So that's a really good reminder that it's okay to struggle.
Yeah.
And that there are strategies that you can use to get through it.
Absolutely.
And then to really solidify all this new vocabulary, the lesson ends with a review section.
Okay, cool.
Which gives definitions and example sentences.
That's great.
For all of the terms that we've been talking about. So we have review, plus, teacher's pet, subtract, minus, times, suck up,
Wow.
divided by smarty pants, square root,
Oh, yeah.
I'll bet, know it all, equation, operation, multiplication, addition, subtraction, division.
That's a lot of words.
It's a lot of words, but I think this review is so helpful because it really cements that understanding, The definitions are clear and the example sentences show you how these words and phrases are used,
Exactly.
in real life.
Yeah.
So, for example, everyone knows that 2 plus 2 equals 4.
Right.
Perfectly illustrates plus.
Yeah.
And we have a colleague at work who's the biggest suck-up, shows how you can use that term outside of school.
Totally.
And I really liked how they included I'll bet, which came up when the teacher said, the square root of 2, I'll bet you're not going to get that one.
Uh-huh.
And it's such a common little phrase in English. It means, I think something is likely.
Right. Yeah.
And then seeing equation and operation defined in a mathematical context really brings everything together.
It does. It shows that math has its own special vocabulary.
Yes, exactly.
Within English.
It's like its own little world.
Yeah.
So to wrap up our deep dive today, you now have a much clearer understanding of the basic English terms for math operations from plus and minus all the way to divided by and square root.
Right.
We've also explored those sometimes pretty harsh slang terms for people who seem really smart, like teacher's pet, suck up, smarty pants, and know it all.
Yeah.
We've seen how these words are used in a classroom setting, and we've even shared some of our own personal experiences with math.
I think it was a good mix.
Yeah, I think so too.
And hopefully people listening feel like they can relate.
Yeah, I hope so. And, now that you have this understanding, you can follow along with mathematical discussions in English and also participate in them with confidence.
Exactly. You're ready to go.
So I'll leave you with this final thought. We've talked about all these different ways that we describe math and intelligence, both the formal terms and those more informal, sometimes even mean nicknames. But how does the language we use actually shape the way that we see these subjects and the way we see the people who are good at them?
That's a really good question.
Is it possible to talk about math and intelligence in a way that is accurate and encouraging?
Right. For everybody.
For absolutely everybody.
Regardless of their ability.
Yeah, regardless of their ability or perceived ability.
Exactly.
So that's something to think about.
Yeah, definitely something to ponder.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Thanks for having me.
It was fun.
It was great.
Okay, we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.